You're listening to Messy Jesus Business, a podcast about radical gospel living. Hi everyone, I'm Sister Julia Walsh, a writer, spiritual director, and jail minister living in Chicago. Welcome to The Mess. At Messy Jesus Business, we explore how the mess of radical gospel living brings disciples into a life of struggle as we advocate for social justice, live simply, serve others, practice contemplation, and live in community. Now, on to our guest. Christiana N. Peterson is the author of Mystics and Misfits, Meeting God Through St. Francis and Other Unlikely Saints, and Awakened by Death, Life-Giving Lessons from the Mystics. Christiana has channeled into her writing the many things that she's learned through the experiences of her life. That includes growing up in Texas, going to graduate school in Scotland, living in intentional community on a farm in Illinois, moving to Ohio so her husband could pastor a Mennonite church, and mothering 4 children. In this episode of Messy Jesus Business, Christiana and I discuss mysticism and saints. We talk about the often taboo topic of death, including grief, our fear and avoidance of the subject, and the potential that the church has to help us develop a healthier relationship with death. We also talk about the role of hospice in a secular society, the importance of rituals, and the responsibility of community in times of loss. Enjoy. Hi, Christiana. Welcome to Messy Jesus Business.
Oh, it's so good to be with you, as always.
Oh, I'm so glad you're here. Yeah, it'll be fun to catch up and hear about your work. And, I've been following you and your work since I think we met some years ago. Not sure what year anymore.
I can't remember. They all run together. It's one big year.
Yeah, but I've definitely felt a resonance, especially with your work about mysticism and your recent book about death. Mortality is something that I'm oftentimes meditating on. And so I'm wondering, how did you become so interested in mystics and death and write about these subjects?
Well, I think death and mysticism, strangely enough, are sort of connected in my mind because it was around the time that I was, we're going to like dive right in now. But
Great.
I was having some really bad depression and anxiety, and even some suicidal, some thoughts of how maybe I didn't want to live anymore. And that was a new experience for me. So kind of as I came out of that time, I'd had a sort of lifelong fear of death and fixation on death. And for the first time, I thought, I need to really lean into this. I need to really explore this and kind of my fear of death. And that was about the time that I picked up a Richard Rohr book, and it was about the mystics. And so those things are so interconnected for me. And in the midst of, mental health issues and the early stages of motherhood, they're just kind of in a mix for me. But I've had a lifelong sort of, from pretty early on, just a fear of death, I think. So it's just a time. I mean, that was several years ago. So the beginnings of this book, or the book that I just wrote, Awakened by Death, started probably about 6 years ago, but it took me several years to really start writing about it.
So did you grow up in a type of faith community that talked about death in a healthy way, or in mysticism, or was this kind of like a new, did this make you kind of a weirdo?
Totally a weird. Well, I've always been a weirdo. I knew hardly anything about the mystics. I mean, I had studied, I was an English major, so we had studied Julian of Norwich and Marjorie Kemp from a literary perspective.
Okay.
But I'd never looked at them from a faith perspective, I had heard of St. Francis, but I didn't know much about him. And so it just kind of came at this perfect time for me, sort of in terms of faith, my faith needing to grow, I guess, and feeling that like my faith was sort of stagnant. And there was something about the mystics, that the way they encounter God, and it's just more than just in the mind, it's just full body, heart, spirit, mind. And I think the background of my church tradition was very much sort of about intellectual faith. And I think that can take you up to a certain point, but after a while, it just kind of felt like, is this all there is? And so I think the mystics kind of were a leaping off point into a richer faith for me. In terms of thinking about death in my childhood, I mean, my dad lost his father when he was 14. And so he was always sort of melancholy and aware of the fragility of life, and that death, could happen to any of us at any time. But I don't think he articulated it that clearly. It was more, he'd leave to go on a business trip and say, I love you and I'll see you again if I don't die, basically.
Oh, wow.
And so it was just sort of the awareness of this is going to happen at some point. But I don't think that my childhood tradition had necessarily any better coping skills than sort of the typical American view of death. I mean, maybe in the Christian perspective, there were some more intellectual, helpful things in speaking about Jesus' resurrection and where we go after we die. But it was very much in the mind. And I think we just live in such a death-averse culture. And I think in some ways, the church can make that worse.
How do you see the church making our cultural avoidance here in the United States of death worse? And like, what happened for you that caused the transformation?
I mean, maybe that's a blanket statement to say the church makes it worse, but
no, let's break it open.
Yeah, let's break that open. I think that the Christian faith has the tools within it, and the scriptures that we adhere to, the story of Jesus and the care for the body, resurrection. I think all of that is such rich language that can be offered to us when it comes to talking about death. But I think that Christianity has become Americanized, the way that Christianity and the American have blended. I think it shows up particularly in the ways that we grieve and in the ways that we have funerals, the very sort of staid and internal ways that we grieve, the ways that we talk about somebody dies and we immediately want to start talking about heaven, and at least they're with God, or at least they're no longer suffering, or at least, in a way, I think people who say that are often trying to soothe their own grief rather than leaning into the grief. So I think it stifles our grief. I think Americans in general don't grieve well. And I think sometimes in church, that language, the language of heaven, can cut off that grieving process when it's not a more holistic, full view. There needs to be space for our grief.
Yeah, this is a really relevant conversation right now because of the fact that we're a year into this COVID-19 pandemic. And I'm sure you did not anticipate that when you started your book or started writing. I know, you wrote about like the Black Plague and oh my goodness, all these things. And here we are dealing with a lot of collective grief and suffering from the loss of over 500,000 just Americans, and then worldwide, even more people who have left us too soon. So I'm wondering what you mean by this idea of lean into death. In the intro to your book, you write that the mystics have given me permission to lean into death. But I really, what does that mean, to lean into it versus be afraid of it or whatever? Like,
well,
because I mean, I'm trying to live. I don't want to like.
I know, and I, this is something I've honestly been struggling with. As when you release a book in a pandemic, people don't want to read about death. understandably. I mean, maybe people never want to read about death,
No, just the morbid cool ones, the morbid weirdos.
Just the morbid cool ones. And
Just
so, yeah, articulating that when people are already being faced with it in ways that many of us who are more privileged have not been faced with death or the realities of death. I totally get it. Like, I don't want to read large tomes about death, although I did for this book. The things that I watch, the movies that I watch, the TV I watch, I want to watch comedies. I don't want to watch, hard documentaries or whatever. So I understand the need to be lighthearted in the midst of a lot of us are suffering from mental health issues and where we've lost people or we're just faced with death more. I'm trying to articulate what that means for us now, whether we do that right this minute or we do it if things ever normalize. I don't know what that will look like for us, but that this time sort of leads us into looking more clearly at our own mortality, accepting. So I guess leaning into death is accepting that we are going to die, that each of us are going to die, and looking at the ways that the fear of death has infiltrated our lives. I've had a lot of people say, well, I'm not afraid of death. I know where I'm going to be. And I think there are genuinely people who are not afraid of death. And I think that's amazing. That's a gift. But I also think the fear of death shows up in our lives in ways we're not always conscious of. So for me, it's a lot of internal work. Like, how have I responded to the COVID outbreak? Have I said, I don't believe this is happening? And is that a fear of death? Have I crawled inside my home and been too afraid to leave? Is that a fear of death? I think, and all along the spectrum, how we respond to this potential for our death. I think the fear of death shows up in a lot of different ways.
Yeah. And what did you discover in your research and writing about how we can be in relationship with death in a way that's healthier? Because I don't think we can, avoid our fears but rather be maybe more mindful about them.
Yeah, I think the healthiest ways I have read about are people who are willing to walk alongside those who are suffering and those who are afraid and those who have lost loved ones. I write about George MacDonald and also St. Francis de Sales. They were both very sort of pastoral, comforting people who would write letters and just walk alongside people who had lost loved ones, because they both knew what it was like to lose loved ones. So I think being willing to be in community with people who are suffering. So it's not only accepting our own death, but being willing to be with other people in the ways that they grieve and in their own death, not avoiding funerals, not avoiding, we have this avoidance of the body and seeing the body after death. We're all really afraid of that. Understandably, it's a strange thing. But I think that there is something that we lose when we give away all of our funeral rituals to someone else that we pay to take care of that. I've been reading Thomas Lynch and Caitlin Doughty, who are both writers. They both write about death a lot and in very different ways. Thomas Lynch is very poetic and Caitlin Doughty is hilarious, but they're both morticians.
Oh, okay.
And they have all of these beautiful insights about death and how it's part of the human experience. And I am kind of like, well, share the love a little bit,
Yeah, right.
They're learning things by being close to death. And I don't think all of us are supposed to be morticians, but I think that there is stuff to be learned and gained from understanding our mortality and being willing to be with other people in when they lose and when they grieve.
As you say all that, it occurs to me that, so I entered my community of Franciscan sisters about 15 years ago. And within a few weeks after I moved in, there was a little series of funerals, and our sisters tend to die in in groups, like pairs or threes.
Death
And
is weird, isn't it?
yeah, death is mysterious.
Yeah.
So anyway, so all of a sudden I was like, oh my word, I just went to more funerals in like just a few weeks span of time than I have in my entire life.
Yeah.
And now as a sister, I've definitely like go to, not recently, but because of the pandemic, but like, yeah, I would say I probably on the like the charts probably have gone to more funerals than the average person. And I think that's a dynamic of being a minister too.
Yeah.
My dad was a hospice nurse when I was growing up. I witnessed a transformation in him. He found a home and a sense of belonging in the ministry of accompanying people to their death.
Oh,
And
man,
I
that's
could
such a
just,
ministry.
and I could see how it just really was a spiritual experience for him, and he would be really touched and moved. And he, as a hospice nurse, I would sometimes get confused, like, Dad, did you just get paid to go to a funeral? He's like, well, yeah, it's part of my job. And I'm like, oh,
well, ministers do too.
I guess. Okay. So, it was like introducing me to the weirdness of work. The rituals of death it's fascinating to me. Like, as you say all this, like people, I didn't even know it's that people don't touch and look at the bodies anymore. Is that's changed?
Yeah. In my research, some of our ancestors would have the wakes in their home.
Oh yeah.
And, laid out in their dining room. There were different reasons for wakes. Of course, back then, people weren't quite sure you were dead. So you needed to be there for a little bit to make sure, is this person really dead? But and they would wash the body themselves instead of sending it to the funeral home. And they sometimes would make their own coffins or sew their own burial shrouds. And it's interesting you talk about ministry, because we moved to Ohio about 4 years ago for my husband to become a minister. And we have an older congregation, so he's done a lot of funerals.
Oh, sure.
And so particularly he has been at the bedside of a few people recently who have died. But he was telling me that he noticed even the language of the funeral home, that coffins are now called caskets, that there's lots of euphemistic language that has been put on, casket's a little bit more of a gentle word than coffin. And when you announce somebody's death, you say they passed away instead of they died, just sort of softening, and I think there's reasons for that. There's good reasons for that in some ways, but there's just not as much, we're just not as much in touch with death as our ancestors, some of our ancestors used to be. You talk about your father being a hospice nurse. I think that hospice nurses, and now they have death doulas, are such an amazing, service for people, especially as people get farther and farther away from faith communities, because, a lot of people don't trust institutions as much anymore. And so they're missing some of these death rituals or people to walk through death with them. So it is these people who, death doulas or hospice workers, that are the only point of contact for them as they're dying. And so, I think they're filling this gap that is beginning to get wider as communities of faith start looking different and those rituals start looking different.
That's so interesting. And it just makes me think about how a lot of things that have probably traditionally fallen to the role of priests and ministers, pastors, and so on, are now going to be falling to secular positions as our society grows to be increasingly secular. So, wow, fascinating. Thank you. Yeah. One of the things I can admit is I've never been with anyone who's died like while they're dying. I've been with people who have died, yes. They've died later.
I haven't either.
No.
Oh. I mean, I've seen them after death, but I haven't actually been able to be with someone as they've died. I mean, I've had loved ones who have died, but I haven't been able to be there at the moment. And I think that often happens, actually, just hearing some hospice workers talk, that a lot of times people will wait till their loved ones have left the room to die. Who knows why? But and there's also, and I don't know if your dad noticed this when he was a hospice worker. But as you said earlier, a lot of times death happens in multiples. If there's like a hospice facility, that more than one person will die in the same night. Just really interesting.
Fascinating. Yeah. Well, even in my own family, when I was in elementary school, my grandpa died. And then I think it was a month later, my great grandma, his mom died.
Oh, wow.
You know, and so, I mean, that happens in families too, when there's bonds and connections, and certain people are probably staying on earth for somebody else. And then they feel a freedom to go. Yeah.
Yeah. My dad and his mother died within, I don't know, 9 months of each other.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
Wow. Do you want to talk about your dad's death?
Sure. Yeah. Yeah. So my dad died actually right before we moved. It was a big transition year. I was pregnant and my grandmother had just died. My sister had just had a stroke, and then my dad died, and then we moved to a new place. So it was, and I was writing my first book, Mystics and Misfits. So it was a bit of a year.
Well, congratulations on surviving that.
Thank you.
Wow.
But yeah, obviously it was hard. But one of the things that was particularly hard for me was that I wasn't there when he died. My family all lives in Texas, and I had been with him at Christmas, and then he died in February. So they weren't all there right when he died, but they all, descended into my mom's house because he had been on hospice in the home. And just like I was on a computer, asking them to show me his body, and the internet connection was bad and it kept, going in and out. And I was just feeling such a sense of obviously loss that he died, but an extra sense of loss that I couldn't be there and touch his body and, see how he looked in death and be able to say goodbye. So that was really, really hard to not be able to be there at that moment.
And was it sudden?
No, he had cancer. I feel like it was maybe two or 3 years from kind of the diagnosis till death. So he had, my timeline might be off. I can't remember dates anymore.
It's all good.
But we knew it was, it was interesting because my mom called me. Actually, she didn't call me that day, but the nurse came because he would have hospice nurse come in. And she checked him and she told my mom, it'll probably be a couple weeks. And my mom said, why don't you tell him? And so she told him, and I think they gave him some pain medicine. And then my mom went away. And then when she came back, he had died. So it's just that mystery of, we really don't know when the moment, even if someone is dying, we don't know when the moment of death will come, or when it's almost like he decided he wasn't going to fight anymore. And so he let go. It's just such a mystery, it's just,
yeah. And you started off by talking about how you used to think about your death in a really dark way. And I'm grateful that you recovered from that time and are still here. Thanks be to God.
Yeah.
Do you still think about your death and how you want to die? Or
I try to meditate on it a bit. Just I take walks in the cemetery and try to think, okay, I will be here one day. And writing about it, I think obviously makes me contemplate it more. And occasionally I'll have a freak out where I'm just like, I'm gonna die. It's I'm a little scared. I don't want to die. We have our bodies, and we're made for survival. So of course we're afraid of, or we're resisting. Most of us are resisting wanting to die. But in terms of like what things would be like after I died, or my funeral, or whatever that looks like, I've tried not to think too much about that, just because I want my family to do what would help them grieve the best. I think that way because I think with my dad's death and his funeral, he really he was a minister. And so he had his funeral like laid out just to the T. And I think it was his way of sort of offering his theology to a captive audience.
Yeah, yeah.
And I
That
think
makes
that was
sense.
yeah,
I totally get that.
yeah, yeah. I think so. I think that was a beautiful thing, but it felt bereft of us and what we needed. And I think it kind of made us feel like, I have two sisters, like we couldn't properly grieve in that moment the way we needed to. So that's what I hope. I guess that's what I hope when I'm gone, that whoever's left behind will do what it, in a healthy way, will do what it takes for them to be able to grieve in a healthy way.
I really admire how for you it's about the care of the other. And it's occurring to me that I'm kind of more like your dad. like what's the theology? Like, yeah, maybe it's a personality thing. So, but our Christian faith is actually supposed to be more about the other than ourselves. So,
well, yeah, I think you care about others a lot. Sometimes I'm a little self-absorbed. It's just because I don't want to think about it. I don't know. Who knows? Who knows with the subconscious stuff?
Right. It's a very mysterious. I mean, and it's all, yeah, who knows? But I mean, I can admit to you that I think that I think when I was like probably not even 10, I one day like started telling my family members, I do remember like we were in the car and I was like, at my funeral, I want you all to sing Amazing Grace. And like all these, I like started naming the hymns and they're like, is this coming soon?
I think we should know. I love that.
I mean, it's just kind of been this like, I know it's going to happen someday, so let me daydream about it. And, and then
like, oh, daydream. Some people daydream about their wedding. You're like, I'm going to daydream about my funeral.
Right? From a little, yeah, I totally did not daydream about a wedding. So I must have been destined to be a nun because there's a lot of funerals in religious life.
That's true.
In fact, so one of the pieces of paperwork that we have to do at the convent is like our funeral planning form. Like what hymns do you want? What readings? What do you want the theme to be?
I love that, actually. I think that is so amazing.
I haven't done mine because I procrastinate on everything that becomes paperwork. If someone would have said, let's sit down and talk about it, they would have the answers.
Just record it.
Yeah.
I mean, I have to say, I have thought about what songs I want at my funeral.
Okay.
But, all of that other stuff. And plus,
Yeah.
I guess it helps that my husband is a minister, although he probably won't want to do my funeral if I go before him,
Yeah.
Somebody else would need to do that. But I'm sure he would make sure there was a lot of good theology. But it is interesting to have like your husband be a minister and their dad. My dad wasn't a pastor. He was like an elder, but he had a PhD in theology. So he was very much like interested in the proper theology. Mm-hmm. And he like had 3 ministers speak at his funeral and he wrote basically what he wanted them to say.
Wow.
And so from the other perspective, I'm like, they were pretty, that was pretty kind of them to be okay with that. Because not every pastor wants to be told what they're supposed to say at a funeral.
Right. Well, I will not write my homily. I'll let
the pastor or
the priest can handle that.
The homily.
Right. Someone else can say that part. But my goodness.
We all cope differently, don't we?
Yeah. And, in my community, there was... in the past few years, since I came to community, one of the sisters who knew she was nearing her death had felt this great passion for creating green burials. And so now we have a green burial system. And so I haven't,
wonderful.
That's something I'll put up on my paperwork is like, I prefer a green burial, but my reluctancy of doing so is that it will mean that I will have to be buried very quickly. And not, maybe there won't be people who can come quickly.
Which is kind of why embalming started, at least in our culture. Obviously, embalming has been around for a long time. I think it was Civil War soldiers. The bodies of Civil War soldiers were embalmed so that their families could see them, see the bodies. So I think that there are times, where it's been a helpful thing for people to grieve. Yeah, I don't want to be embalmed either. Yeah, it's some interesting things when you read about embalming and it's
Yeah.
not great for the earth. And yeah, it's
Huh.
just,
Huh.
yeah. That's
Fascinating.
really neat. That's really neat that they have a green burial system because that's not, I don't think that's usual. I think it's becoming more popular, which is great. But
Yeah, and I know they had to do a lot of legal work to get approved because
mhm.
there's all these laws about how you can be buried and
Yes,
oh
yeah,
my goodness, that was
yeah.
enlightening for me.
Mhm.
Yeah.
Which
Yeah.
is why it's hard. Like, my husband and I have talked about if one of us dies, what do we want to do? And, when the moment of grief comes, if you don't have a community that's already doing that, of course, you'll just go to what your community is tending to do, which is, the mortician comes or they probably don't call them morticians anymore, but they come and they take the body and they embalm or whatever. So it's like swimming upstream to do something different.
Mm.
So, I've thought about wanting to learn more about that before it comes, because
Hmm.
you don't want to do that when you're grieving. You want
Yeah.
to leave space for the grief and not be figuring out, well, how do I wash my husband's body?
Right, right. Yeah. I don't that does sound awful.
Yeah.
Or just even the awfulness of like logistical planning is stressful in ordinary
Yeah.
times. And then if you're
Yeah.
grief too. Yeah.
Yeah.
You've mentioned community a few times, and I'm
Yeah.
wondering what your belief is about the role that the community ought to have in these mysteries,
Mhm.
especially in light of the fact that this conversation is going to be airing during the Triduum on probably Holy Thursday, Good Friday is when
Yeah.
listeners will pick up this podcast and tune in. So I'm Catholic. I,
Yeah.
I know your family, your husband is Mennonite,
Mhm.
so like
Mhm.
you're from a very different tradition. But in the Catholic Church, we tend to be embracing the crucifix, embracing the cross, like the death,
Mhm.
and
Yes.
is something that is a part of our spirituality, memento mori, like remember your death, prepare
Yeah.
for your death, recognize that um, that our mortality is a big part of our prayer life and our life of
Mhm.
penance. Those tend to be private, individual,
Mm.
personal things that we're doing.
Mhm.
So, what's the role of the community then?
Hmm. That's really interesting. That's a great question. I mean, and I want to say, I think those are some of the things that were lost in the Reformation for a wide swath of Christians is all those beautiful ancient traditions of the Catholic Church, the Ars Moriendi, the death rituals that I think left a lot of Protestants floundering after the Reformation because they were afraid to do anything that looked too Catholic.
Yeah, yeah.
So I just think that's where so much of my beloved contemplative spiritual traditions have come from the Catholic Church. But yeah, I think that one of the roles of community is, and what you were saying earlier, that once you became a sister, you suddenly were saw or you were involved in 3 funerals more than you'd ever been involved in.
Yeah.
And I think, when we're really invested in a multi-generational, multicultural community, then we're offered the chance to be a part of death more. Because if we're kind of living sort of isolated, and we're all more isolated than we've ever been now, people die alone more often, and I don't think we were meant to die alone. So you hear about just the heartbreaking stories of people having to say goodbye to their loved ones over an iPad because they weren't allowed in the hospital. And
During COVID, yeah.
yeah, just, I just feel such an ache for the lonely deaths that are happening now. And my hope is that as we move more into being able to be with each other more, that we'll crave more of that community, that we'll crave being with each other in those important moments in the human experience. So I guess the community of faith for me is that you walk alongside people in these moments in life every day, but especially in these deep moments in life, to know that they're not alone, the family that's left behind, to be there as a witness to their grief. And I think part of mourning is the public mourning that a lot of cultures, and I think this is something that we struggle with in our culture, a lot of cultures have more vocal mourning.
Mm.
They have professional mourners that come and wail in order for the family and friends of the deceased to be able to feel comfortable to publicly mourn. And I think a lot of those cultures see the way we do things as unhealthy because we're not able to, we have our private mourning that comes after, but our public mourning is such an important part of our grief for other people to say, that person is mourning. I need to remember that person is mourning. That person has lost something. Because in our culture, we lose somebody and then we're expected to just, okay, after a few weeks, it's time to move on. It's time to get on with your life. Instead of the long mourning periods that people used to have, even in the Victorian culture, they wore black for a really long time. We just don't have, we have so few of those things in our Euro-Western culture to help us through grief that we just end up turning it inward, I think.
Yeah. So in a way, giving each other the permission to like authentically wear our feelings, our experience, our emotions on our sleeve, right? And to like claim it and maybe stopping with the platitudes of like, oh, they're in a better place. Come on, people. Like, how is that a nice thing to say to somebody?
It's not helpful. It's not helpful. I mean, I think a lot of times that's more about the person saying it than it is about trying to help or comfort,
well,
the person.
Or for me, it's like it's such a symptom of we don't know how to be with, right? And what I'm really, I think, hearing is that that's actually what community, the call of the community is in these situations of grief and death, is that we are just meant to be companions to one another, not fix it, not even like try to like offer something to make them feel better, but truly companion and be with and be present to, tend to them in what they are and not try to change it.
I think so. And I have to, I notice these things that I'm a part of this, so I struggle with this too. I mean, how would I feel if I had somebody, if I lost a loved one and somebody came and started wailing in the funeral? Like, how would I feel? I might be taken aback, or maybe it would have given me permission to do the same. And, so it's like, how do we fix this? We're sort of embedded in it, So
yeah. I think I heard once someone say something judgmental about somebody of like, oh, they just go to the drama of death all the time and they just feel all the feelings for every single person that dies. And I was like, wow, that's a gift. Like,
that was a good thing.
Right? But it was, I think making people uncomfortable if they're doing that sort of public wailing.
And I think you're right. Some people are gifted with that, and it will make people uncomfortable. Anything that changes the status quo is going to make people uncomfortable. But that's been the case over all of human history.
Yes, amen.
Amen.
In the midst of all these mysteries and what you're learning and your own journey of faith and discovery and being in community, what is discipleship for you?
It's funny. Until I got to the Mennonite church, I had never really heard the word discipleship.
May I ask? What tradition you grew up in?
I grew up in the Church of Christ. I mean, I had heard the word, but it was a word that Mennonites used more than the tradition I grew up in. And I think, and one of the things that I've loved about the Mennonite church is that they take Jesus' humanness and his life so seriously. And I think St. Francis did this, obviously. And one of the things I love about St. Francis is that Jesus's life was not just a good example. This was like a model of how we're to live. So discipleship to me, I guess, is trying to live more like Jesus.
And when you think of living more like Jesus, like are there particular actions or virtues or something that comes to mind?
Well, I think being with people in their suffering, and not placing our hope in money, trying to live more simply, which is always a struggle when you have 4 kids. It's interesting because my husband was just preaching on Jesus in the Garden of Gethsemane. And he and I talk about death all the time, of course. That's just a conversation that we have a lot. But he said it was in the Gospel of Mark. And he was saying how interesting it was that Mark doesn't soften Jesus's anguish as he approaches death. So Jesus sort of runs the gamut of human emotions and fear and grief as he approaches his death. And that's a model for us as we approach death as well, that Jesus did it too. And that passage actually has made a lot of Christians over the centuries uncomfortable, because Mark just sort of lays it out really starkly that Jesus was terrified, that it wasn't when the angel came and comforted him. That wasn't in that gospel. He was just terrified and, anguished. So I think, if I'm thinking about in terms of death and Jesus, that's one thing, is like, it's okay to grieve. And in fact, Jesus did it. And it's okay to be afraid. And in fact, Jesus was afraid. And so, yeah, for me, it's the simplicity and leaning into the suffering of others and seeing the wide range of human experience and human emotion.
And all that you described sounds pretty countercultural and radical in light of how we have highlighted how this culture, the culture we're a part of, predominant American culture, white culture, I would say too, especially,
yes, for sure,
avoids death, right? And deals with it in unhealthy ways. Yeah, thanks, Jesus, for modeling that for us.
Thank you,
Jesus. Yeah.
Sure.
So, Christiana, what is messy about all this for you?
Oh, it's all messy. I think death, a beautiful word for death is mysterious, but the realistic word is that it's messy. And I think for me personally, it's messy because I spent a year writing this book in order to sort of come to terms with my own fear of death. And it's still there. That's the reality, is that it's still there. I still have to every day lean into it and contemplate and, do the internal work. So, but I think that's part of the work, is recognizing that the fear is there and sort of being awakened to our fear and taking that journey toward healing in that way. Taking the internal journey where we're offering our fear to God. And it is in that act of offering and humility that we grow and we're transformed.
Sounds a lot like the Easter story.
It does.
Well, thank you so much for coming on to Messy Jesus Business. How can our listeners follow your work and learn more about you and your writing?
Well, I have a website, ChristianaNPeterson.com, and I'm on social media, but I do most stuff on Instagram, just Christiana N. Pete.
Okay, great. Yeah.
Thanks for having me.
Thank you so much. I invite you to join me in this contemplative moment. Whereas Christiana and I discussed how the Christian tradition has a lot of potential and tools for helping people be in a healthy relationship with the reality of death, but yet doesn't, I would like to read for you some scripture from our tradition that reminds us what Christians believe about death. This passage is from Romans, and It's very brief. I invite you to close your eyes and breathe deeply as you take it in and listen. And pay attention to whether any words or phrases stick out for you. Consider if there's a particular message that God wants you to hear today. Our reading from Romans chapter 14, verses 7 through 9. None of us lives for oneself, and no one dies for oneself. For if we live for the Lord, and if we die for the Lord. So then, whether we live or die, we are the Lord's. For this is why Christ died and came to life, that he might be Lord of both the dead and the living. That's it for this episode of Messy Jesus Business. Thanks for listening. Messy Jesus Business is produced and hosted by me, Sister Julia Walsh, and edited by Cherish Bedzinski. You can find us online at messyjesusbusiness.com and on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, and Patreon. If you like what you heard, please be sure to mention our podcast to your friends and followers. And we'd love to have your support via Patreon. From the bottom of our hearts and the middle of the mess, thank you. Messy Jesus Business is produced in partnership with the Franciscan Sisters of Perpetual Adoration. You can learn more about our religious community and donate to our mission at www.fspa.org. I'm Sister Julia Walsh, and I'll catch up with you next time. Until then, peace and all good.